Welcome to the 3030 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Dr. Ruiz.
Hello everyone, super excited for my show today. My guest today is Lucy Mailing. She graduated from Kalamazoo College with a BA in biology and is now a fourth-year MD PhD candidate in the Division of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Illinois. Her research focuses on how diet and exercise can beneficially modulate the gut microbiome and gut barrier function in states of health and disease. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hello everyone, super excited to be here with my friend Lucy Mailing. Lucy, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
We met about a year ago, almost a year ago at AHS, and I was like, I need to have you on my show. And, shit happens and you forget it. I still have your card, in my desk, and I'm like, okay, Rob Abbott interviewed her. I'm like, I have to have her on the show now. So I asked Rob to reintroduce us, and now you're here. Before we start, what is your hero story? How did you come into this ancestral movement?
Sure. So like a lot of people in the integrative medicine space, I came through my own health journey. I struggled with chronic eczema for pretty much my whole childhood and was never really given any satisfactory answers by dermatologists, allergists, pediatricians, family doctors, you name it. Pretty much just given more potent steroid creams and told that this was something I was going to either have to live with or hopefully grow out of. And first couple years of college, I was pretty convinced that it wasn't something that I was going to grow out of. And in fact, it seemed to be getting worse. And around that time, my sister actually suggested that there might be a connection between what I was eating and my skin condition. I was very resistant to that idea. No doctor had ever told me that diet had anything to do with your skin. And I was a compulsive junk food eater for most of my childhood. No interest in nutrition whatsoever. And over the next couple months, really kind of turned that paradigm completely over on its head and started experimenting with my diet, started seeing positive changes, really dug into the research because I was at that point already a biology major and just found all of this information about the connection between the gut and the skin and in the gut and all kinds of different chronic diseases. And that's when I decided to pursue an MD PhD program in nutritional sciences and study the gut microbiome so that I could bring this information to more people and provide more evidence for the gut-skin axis and the role of the gut microbiome in different diseases.
So family reunions must be really annoying with your sister saying, told you so every time, huh?
Yeah, actually, my parents have been extremely supportive of my whole journey and have improved their own diets, in seeing all of the work that I've done and the improvements that I saw with changing my diet. They've also made a lot of improvements to their diets as well.
It's so crazy, because the toughest people to reach is your family, and I'm talking about those friends that you have deeper connections. They're your family. They look at you and like, you're full of shit. But so kudos to you for listening to your sister.
Definitely. It was not, I owe her a lot for being extremely persistent because I did not listen the first time. In fact, I still have the conversations saved between the two of us via text. And you can see that my response to her suggesting that I try gluten-free diet was initially no in all caps.
It's
I'm not eating what I want.
Yeah. So when Lucy becomes Dr. Mailing and you have your doctor degree awarded to you, I want your sister to go up to you and be like, I told you. So, let's dig into this, because we do have a lot of people that suffer with cravings. You said you were a serial junk food eater. Do you have a sweet tooth or did you have a sweet tooth?
Oh, I definitely had a huge sweet tooth. And I would say I still do to some extent in that I enjoy the occasional paleo sweets or desserts, but it definitely came down significantly. And actually, I found that I'm one of those people who I actually don't do well with moderation. It's either all or nothing. So I found it quite easy to say, okay, I'm just gonna. Once I decided to cut out like refined sugar, I was fine cutting it out for months, no problem. But it was if I had a little, I had a problem because that sweet tooth would want to come back, and my old habits of eating for comfort, eating for out of boredom, that kind of thing. So.
And because I don't have a sweet tooth, so I cannot, connect with people when they say, oh, I just want some hot tamales or I just want some Sour Patch Kids. That does not, register as something that is desirable. But most of the people that I treat, most of my patients do. And I like to ask my guests, do you have a strategy or did you do something, or was it just like cold turkey?
I think initially I did a lot of paleo sweets to try and transition into, baking my own with lower amounts of sugar, to kind of transition into the fact that I was taking away all of these things that I really liked. And that was kind of initially when I was first not really understanding the research either, but just trying to do my own experimentation. So I definitely tried to make it gradual at first, but I think it's different for everybody. I think some people do better with cold turkey. And eventually I did just say, okay, I'm not gonna have sugar. And I even went far down the road to ketogenic diet for a while and cut out sweets entirely. But I do think my palate really changed because as a kid, I couldn't even fathom the idea of eating green vegetables. And now, I love them. And that's more what I crave than the sugar.
And you see that a lot. You start on a paleo diet or an ancestral diet and you really don't know what to eat or what to, consume or whatever. So you are like self-selecting for better foods, more nutritionally dense foods. And then you start looking at Pinterest and Facebook and you start looking at recipes. And then you start paleoifying, foods, and I call them paleo foods. And now you're back to high nutritional density with really high quality ingredients, but really processed things, like paleo brownies or paleo pizza. They ain't nothing paleo but pizza. And then you end up at the same place that you started. Can you tell us in your investigation and you're coming to the data and the studies, how does processed food, whether they're paleo or not, affect your gut microbiome?
I think that's a great thing to explore here. I think essentially when I was transitioning, it was mentally easier for me to switch to those what you call paleo foods. And it helped me mentally with the transition, but I really didn't see that much healing with my gut health until I transitioned more into a whole foods a diet from there and kind of avoided those, paleo treats, ultra processed foods as much as possible. In terms of the research and we don't have a lot of research on the paleo foods, but we do have a lot of research on the Western diet, what a processed food diet does to the gut microbiome. And it definitely induces major dysbiosis in the gut microbiome. They've done feeding studies. It's hard to do those kind of nutritional studies in humans, but they've done feeding studies in animals where they've, ground up the material more, ultra processed it. And it definitely has a dramatic impact on the gut microbiome, typically, especially reducing the number of bacteria that ferment fiber and produce beneficial compounds in the gut, and increasing the number of potentially pathogenic bacteria that like to feed on the refined sugars and carbohydrates.
Let's dig a little bit into that now. So what are some of these compounds that bacteria are fermenting that are beneficial? Things like butyrate, and what are those compounds doing to you? And then what happens when you have that switch? And I don't know, any easy way for someone that is completely new to this concept about why is it bad to have more of one bacteria than the other?
Sure. So the compound that is most well known is butyrate, which is produced from the fermentation of dietary fiber in the gut by beneficial microbes. And butyrate has a number of different effects. It's actually the major fuel for your gut cells, the cells that line the gut. And without that fuel, those cells actually starve for energy. And what happens is they kind of switch to producing lactate. And those cells then leak lactate into the gut. And the emerging picture in the research now is that lactate leaking into the gut can potentially fuel the growth of pathogenic bacteria. So it's actually directly the loss of, it's not just that we're losing the microbes that are producing butyrate, but we're also actually fueling the growth of these potentially pathogenic microbes when you don't have enough fiber and you don't have enough butyrate production.
What makes them pathogenic?
There's definitely a fine line there, because there's a number of bacteria in the gut that can be commensal organisms. They can be completely harmless in low abundance, but many of these are what we call opportunistic pathogens. And that means that when the right conditions arise, they can expand in abundance and produce, they may upregulate certain factors, certain virulence factors that allow them to really cause damage in the gut. So there are definitely microbes that we think we kind of put in a beneficial camp and microbes that we put in a strictly pathogenic camp, but there's definitely a lot of room in the middle for these opportunistic pathogens. And those can really make or break whether you have a healthy gut microbiome or an unhealthy gut microbiome.
And it's funny because, in my practice, whenever I'm treating someone with gut problems, you have the three columns, with the doctor's data, stool analysis, and you have like the good beneficial bacteria. Then in the middle, you have the commensal flora, and then you have the pathogenic bacteria. And I see a lot of people with dysbiosis more so than with an overt infection. And when you see this dysbiosis, you'll see like lactobacillus or bifidobacter or like the good type of E. coli being in the lower side. So like a +1 growth, and then this commensal or like neither good or bad bacteria, really high levels at a +4. And I see that a lot with my patients.
Yeah, I do think that there's a lot of cases where there's an insufficiency dysbiosis. Like you mentioned, there's 2 low levels of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. I've actually moved away from using culture-based stool tests that use that +0 to 4 system, mostly because it's been shown that there are many bacteria that are not detectable by culture. And the other thing is, unfortunately, the culture methods, while they're good for identifying whether a bacteria is present, the bacteria that tend to grow the best in culture are the ones that are going to end up being a 4+. So it's interesting, if you actually run a culture-based stool test next to like a PCR-based stool test, you can often see that sometimes the culture-based bacteriology isn't quite accurate in terms of relative abundance, but it can definitely give us an idea of where to look further into for sure.
And it's funny, because I did a lot of work with herbal antimicrobials and growing a lot of bacteria, and there are some fastidious bacteria that don't grow. And you have a TSA, tryptic, so agar, and you can grow, E. coli like nothing. And then you put in some bacillus or something that's going to grow a little bit slower, So what test are you using right now? What have you looked at the research into it, and what made you change, and what is the best out there for you in your experience?
I was actually using doctor's data for a while until I kind of did a deep dive into the different options for stool testing. And of course, in the lab, we're using PCR-based testing. So I did a lot of research and also a lot of internal testing, sending the same sample to different labs and seeing what kind of results I got back. And ultimately, I determined at the moment I'm using GI map, which uses quantitative PCR. I also usually accompany that with some kind of 16S-based test like uBiome or Thrive. And then I'm looking more into metagenomics companies because the cost for that is coming down significantly. But I'm not yet convinced that metagenomics provides more clinically actionable information for the average client. So I'm definitely, I think it's kind of a moving target. I think even just recently, culture was the best we've had. I think at the moment, I'm liking GI map because it's not too much different in cost from the culture-based test, but it seems to be more accurate in terms of the bacteria that it's identifying, and it also looks for parasites and fungi, which the 16S tests don't. So I've done a whole big analysis which people can find on my website if they're interested.
That's my problem with DNA-based tests that, I haven't looked into it in a while, but I didn't find any clinical benefit, so it's cool to, it's like 23andMe or any DNA-based, your genome. Cool, you have your genome. It really doesn't provide me, or it's not going to change the way I treat a person. When I was looking at things like uBiome or Viome, I didn't find any clinical relevance. But maybe it's time for me to go back, and maybe we can grab coffee at AHS and talk about this and see what you found, because I need to refresh this. You're the second person that told me about GI maps, so I'm going to be looking at them now. So thank you for that.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Love to discuss that more.
So you went, you started doing junk food, and then you started getting some skin conditions and stuff like that. And then you switch, thanks to your sister. And then what was what's going on, and what did you find out to be a connection between your gut and your skin?
So unfortunately, I do not have any baseline testing, and I hate that I didn't spring for any at the time, but I was in undergrad back then, didn't have a lot of funds for functional tests, so I unfortunately didn't know exactly what kind of gut pathology I might have had at the beginning. I do know that I found out that I had a number of food intolerances or sensitivities that I wasn't aware of. Transitioning to first a paleo diet and then to the autoimmune protocol really helped me identify that there were several foods that were contributing to my skin inflammation. Particularly eggs and soy were major ones for me. I also found out that I had essentially histamine intolerance or some kind of mast cell activation issue going on. And that was huge, because then when I finally combined the autoimmune protocol with a low histamine diet, then I finally saw real changes. And it was definitely a long process, and definitely sometimes I made mistakes and I ended up in a bigger flare than before. But ultimately for me, it was an autoimmune protocol, low histamine approach that eliminated some of these food triggers.
Before you started this paleo, did you have any more constipation or diarrhea, or was it a combination of, or did you have normal bowel movements?
I wouldn't say I had constipation or diarrhea, but I don't know that I would have said I had normal bowel movements either. But if you'd asked me when I was younger, I would have said they were fine, because I didn't really know any different. But I didn't really have any overt gut symptoms growing up. It was really just the eczema, and that's why I didn't really understand the gut-skin connection for so long, is because I never really had any of that. Kind of after I started some of my experimentation and changing my diet, I did develop some kind of IBS-like symptoms. And I think that may have just been that my gut was not used to a diet that had fibers in it. And it may just have been that transition. And so it kind of took some ironing out of that and some different approaches to then focus more on that. But yeah, I didn't exactly have overt gut symptoms at the beginning. I kind of saw them a little bit through my transition in my dietary changes and everything.
And that's something that's frustrating to a lot of people, because maybe you were eating a standard American diet and you didn't think you have any symptoms, and you were eating pizza and bagels, and now you look at a bagel and you get stomach cramps or diarrhea, and they're like, well, before, when I was eating a regular diet, I didn't have any food intolerances. Or you'll hear people say, oh, I don't want to quit doing wheat because then I'm going to develop food allergy towards it. What's your explanation for that? Like, in your experience, you didn't have IBS symptoms when you were eating standard American diet, and now you exclude some foods, and now you are feeling some IBS symptoms.
Sure. I mean, to be completely honest, I think my gut was so inflamed that I was not absorbing anything from what I was eating. Because to be honest, looking back, I probably ate 3,000 calories a day, but I was 100 pounds in high school. And the only explanation to me is that, I wasn't able to absorb any nutrients from the food I was eating. And I think that probably was also reflected in my gut microbiome as well. And when I started to transition to a healthier diet and my intestines started to heal, normal function started to come back, but it kind of needed some some time to iron itself out. And if you've lost those microbes, or they're in such low abundance, those beneficial microbes that are able to process the fiber and produce beneficial compounds like butyrate, it takes a while for them to, come back in abundance and rebalance with the microbes that were kind of taking over before, the more opportunistic pathogens that were taking over before, feeding on the refined sugars and carbohydrates. It just kind of takes, I think, some time to find that new ecosystem. And there's some really interesting research groups that are looking at kind of the microbiome from an ecological perspective, and the idea that there might be multiple stable states of the gut microbiome. And it might just take a little bit more to push yourself into a more stable state, a different stable state that's healthier. But that stable state might involve a little bit of bloating or discomfort before you can get to an even better stable state that's associated with health. So I think it's all just kind of part of the healing process.
You mentioned too that you even tried keto. I'm thinking that you went probably through the same stepwise process that a lot of my patients and even me have gone through, where you're eating a standard American diet and then you go paleo and then things get better and then you double down and you're like, maybe I need more restriction, and then you go into a keto diet. Or what was your experience? Are you still doing keto, or are you did you move away from it?
I still cycle in and out of ketosis on occasion, less so lately because I've been doing more training, exercise training. But I actually think keto was instrumental in my healing. My skin always seemed to do really well if I did like almost a full day fast, just eating one meal a day. And if I was in ketosis, I think I got a greater level of healing, partly because I didn't really do well with starch for a long time. And just by nature of inhibiting starch and inhibiting some of the really high FODMAP foods, it was easier to be in ketosis. And I do think that the research really does support the fact that a ketogenic diet could benefit the gut. It's one of the things I really want to study to show definitively. But I think that in the absence of butyrate producers, you can actually have ketone bodies feed the gut cells instead, because one of the primary ketone bodies, is beta hydroxybutyrate. And that can potentially feed the colon cells and provide them a fuel source, especially when you have gut inflammation going on. So I think in the short term, it was very beneficial for me to kind of dip into ketosis for a while, and I really started to see a lot of healing there. And it was only really after my skin healed completely that I started to incorporate more carbs and diversify a little bit.
And again, doing keto the right way with nutritionally dense foods, because if you start eating keto brownies and keto pizza, now you're going to start feeding the wrong bacteria. Like, for example, and I haven't tried in a very long time, things like coconut flour just wreck me. And,
really?
Oh, yeah. And I think it's just, and again, I haven't done it in a very long time, because a long time ago I tried it. It probably was like a pizza or something that had coconut flour, and just I bloat and I didn't do well. Nowadays, I can eat my weight in rice, or like white rice, yuca, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and I process them so well. And not that I need to introduce coconut flour into my diet, but I think that maybe at the time, even though it was keto or paleo or whatever, my gut biome wasn't ready to process such high levels of fiber. Even though they're like, paleo or whatever, it's still a processed food that has a super physiological effect on your intestine. I've been working on my gut for a very long time, and nowadays I prefer ketosis. I like being at a certain level of ketosis, but I can kick my heels and take a bunch of starch and do perfectly well with it. Now, what do you think about butyrate supplements?
I have been looking into that more, actually. I've written about this quite extensively, and I think that butyrate supplements that are targeted to the colon and are slow release, providing a more physiologic dose of butyrate, can definitely be beneficial and have been shown to be beneficial in a number of randomized controlled trials. I do think that there are some, butyrate salts out there that you can basically almost take as much as you want. Even, some of them are in a powdered form. And I think there is evidence that too much butyrate could potentially inhibit the stem cells in the gut from proliferating. And too much butyrate might actually impair wound healing. So there's definitely some evidence to suggest that. I think we need a lot of more research on supplemental butyrate, but I've also come across a lot of interesting research recently that suggests that butyrate supplementation during antibiotics might be protective against C. diff. So there might be certain situations or certain conditions where butyrate can be more effective supplementally.
And the problem with butyrate is that it smells awful, and and it's not water soluble. So it's very difficult to actually deliver, the butyrate. Any particular products that you like?
I really like Probutyrate, which is made from, I think it's Tesseract is the company that makes it, and I don't have any affiliation with them. I just really like that they've created this. It's basically a complex with fiber. So it's specifically, because it's complexed in fiber, it actually doesn't activate or start releasing butyrate until it gets to the colon. And they've been able to demonstrate that in studies. So far, that's the one that I've been using most with clients with good success. They've also done a number of clinical trials as well.
Now, for your own gut health, did you do any antibiotic or herbal protocols?
I did not do any antibiotics. I had too many of those when I was a kid. I was, for better or for worse, I was kind of swearing off any pharmaceutical treatments for the time being when I was first starting my gut health journey. And I did use quite a lot of different herbal products. I will say that when I started my experimentation, I was aware of very little of the research. And that still to this day kind of bothers me because I was really shooting in the dark with a lot of these things. Probably in some cases could have done myself more harm than good, but I was desperate. And I tried my best to do research on the internet, but at that time I wasn't really adept at reading the nitty-gritty scientific literature. So I probably did some things that were not evidence-based. That's part of the reason why I'm doing my blog today, is because I feel like I have the ability to look at the evidence and share that with people so that they can make educated decisions about trying to improve their gut health with herbals and other things that are actually supported by science. And I love that you've done a lot of peer-reviewed research with herbals, because I think we need a lot more of that.
And it's so frustrating, because when you're doing the presentations, you finish your presentation, and I spent 4 years of my life, and I still do, in the lab, benchtop work with 4 plants, and it's taken me so long to even peek underneath, how these plants are working. And then you do a presentation, and someone raises their hand. Have you tried garlic? Have you tried, what about black seed oil? And I'm like, it is such a mountain to even do 4 little plants. And what people don't realize is that when you go through a PhD program, you might land on a job or a program that is looking at one protein within one pathway within, so like this little protein, and the whole lab is working on like, how does it, translate, or how, like this tiny little section, and you're like super proficient at this tiny little pathway protein within one thing. I was lucky enough to, when I was working at the ASU virology lab, I had 4 different plants. That's unheard of, and I was, doing my research with that. But there is so much to learn, and it is just so captivating and amazing to be able to see how these things are working within our gut or our systems, in general. But it's really funny, and I cringe every time you see a new product coming out or a new supplement, and it's like, oh, this herb, it has antibacterial, antiviral, it's carminative, and it helps with the gut. And then another product, it's antiviral, antibacterial, carminative, and it helps with the gut. Because sure, this plant might have some effect on it, but when you start looking at the formulations of some of these supplements, they look like they just walked into an herbalist shop and they was like, I'll pick this and then this and this and this, and they're just, they make no sense in my head. At last AHS, I presented on the evolutionary mechanisms of antibacterial activity on 4 different plants, and how, if basically plants are genetically related, they might share the same mechanism. And if you're repeating those plants, like 2 things that are closely related, like lavender and lemon balm, you're probably repeating the same mechanism of action, and your chances of becoming resistant to that are way higher than if you use 2 plants that were completely different, like a lamiaceae and a roseate. And we need to be a little bit more careful. And I love how you owned it, that you said I probably did some bad stuff to my gut by treating yourself. So what's the saying? A doctor that treats himself has a fool for a patient. So if you think you have some gut pathogens or something like that, get yourself a practitioner. That is probably one of the most important things you can do. That was you just ran.
No, I think it's great you share all that. Actually, I think I missed your talk at AHS, but I made a point to go back and watch it after, and that was definitely really eye-opening to me to learn about the different how we can acquire resistance to different herbs. I think that's something most people are not aware of, and they're just blindly taking herbals without considering that. So, but I think herbals have so much potential as well, because unlike antibiotics, there's actually herbals that seem to have a prebiotic effect in the gut, and so they're not only potentially inhibiting pathogenic bacteria, but stimulating the growth of certain bacteria we think to be beneficial.
We definitely need to study it, and we need to invest, and we need to put money. Now, so we talked about that wonderful conference, the Ancestral Health Symposium. You're going to be presenting this year. What are you going to be talking? So just a tease. I don't want you to give your whole presentation. What are you going to be talking about?
Sure. So I was originally presenting on just exercise and the microbiome, because I was hoping we'd have some of our metagenomics and metabolomics data from a study that we're working on at the moment, but it looks like that won't come through quite in time. So I think I'm going to present an overview of microbial therapeutics, which will include exercise, but will also include diet, probiotics, prebiotics, and really just a brief overview of the evidence for each of those.
Because there is evidence, and people, roll their eyes, like, oh yeah, my eczema doesn't have to do anything with my gut. But there is evidence on it, and sometimes, we're too lazy or too bombarded with other things that we don't go and look at it. So this is a great conference to try to see the evidence about this ancestral and evidence-based therapeutics and interventions. Now, I just interviewed Angie for a Facebook Live. I don't know if you watched that, and if you didn't, you should definitely go watch it. She's such a cool girl, and you guys are working on a super special project. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've teamed up with Angie Alt, and we are doing a study of the autoimmune protocol diet in eczema and psoriasis. And we're also going to be looking at how the autoimmune protocol, or AIP as it's called, affects the gut microbiome and gut barrier function. So this is kind of, I did this anecdotally. I used AIP, through finding Angie's site and information about the autoimmune protocol, and I was able to heal my own chronic eczema. And I want to be able to show it in peer-reviewed research. So I've teamed up with Angie, and we actually just today we reached our crowdfund.
No way!
Goal.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So we should be recruiting within. Well, actually, probably we'll be recruiting by the time this airs.
That's awesome, and congratulations on that, because it's just so interesting and so important to have this evidence and to chip away at the establishment and show that lifestyle interventions can be more powerful than pharmaceuticals. So, what are some of the interventions, or what's the intervention that you guys are going to be doing?
Sure. So we're using Angie's online program, SAD to AIP in 6, which is basically a phased, gradual adjustment into the autoimmune protocol. So it eliminates a few different foods every week, replacing those with more nutrient-dense foods. So that will be a 6-week phased elimination period, and then there will be a 4-week maintenance period where they're maintained on the autoimmune protocol. So that's essentially the intervention. This is going to be completely remote, so they'll just log in every day, get their weekly assignments, what they need to be eliminating, get support through Angie's program, and implement those diet and lifestyle changes in their home. We think that's even better than coming to do it in the lab, because then hopefully they'll actually be able to sustain that as well. So, and then throughout the study, we'll also be collecting fecal samples for gut microbiome analysis. And we're also going to do the lactulose mannitol test,
Cool.
which I'm sure you're familiar with, to see if AIP has an effect on gut barrier function as well.
This is so cool because, like you said, it's a remote, but most importantly, and what really like geeks me out about this is how this is not an isolated intervention. It's not like you're by yourself at your house, and it kind of shows something that we intuitively know, but maybe we haven't proved that community is so important, and engagement, and having people, back you and share their experiences in a group setting. There's been a lot of studies about group treatment, like for diabetes, and how much more powerful they are whenever you have like a room of 20 people and you do a group lecture, and then you take each individual on their own, and then you go over labs, and that's way more powerful and affects deeper than the doctor-patient single room, isolated approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's going to be a key part of the program. And Angie's already been involved in 2 research studies, which I'm sure she talked about with you, one for Hashimoto's and one for inflammatory bowel disease, that were both successful. So I think her model with having that group support is just fantastic. And it really helps to gradually get people to transition onto the autoimmune protocol. And that also is really helpful to have that support in doing it gradually and being able to work through obstacles and things like that.
New question that I'm going to start asking all my guests. Within the functional medicine community, we see a lot of people that are diagnosed with IBS or with Hashimoto's, and they let their illness define them, and I'm trying to break that. I don't want people to be identified for something that is a mismatch to their environment. So I want to ask you, what defines you?
Oh man, that is a great question. I would say self-improvement, being 1% better every day, and always striving to make a greater impact with my work and how I interact with people, and just always looking to move the needle one step closer to a better me.
So not your eczema, not your, not your involvement in the ancestral community, but just improving everyone's life and your life and everyone around you. That's awesome. Lucy, such an awesome interview. Where can people find you? How can people get a hold of you? Where can people contact you and annoy you?
Sure. My website is ngmedicine.com. You can also just Google my name, Lucy Mailing. And I'm also on Instagram and Facebook at NextGen Medicine.
Fantastic interview. I will be seeing you at AHS. Let's hang out. Let's annoy Rob Abbott. My goal is to get him to do some beat poetry. NorCal Margaritas might have to be involved, but I want that dude to perform. So
that sounds great. Thanks so much for having me on.
No problem. I'll talk to you soon. Okay.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.